We all agree that emissions have to stop by 2050. That's the law of the UK. So either the new technology options we were discussing in the last film deliver in the next 28 years, or we have to do something else. And given that none of them operate at full scale at the moment, then therefore the lowest risk approach is to plan for getting to zero emissions with technologies that operate today already, while continuing to develop all the new ideas. If they grow, that's terrific, but we shouldn't be caught out and bet everything on something which currently doesn't exist, taking over the entire operation of the country within 28 years. It's sensible to plan to do something else, and that's what we're going to look at in this film. Let's start with the three resources. We said last time that everything depends on these. So firstly, the graph of carbon storage, powered carbon storage in the UK. You can see that we're hoping to have around about 200 megatons per year of it. That's the scale of the axis. But what we've actually got is zero. We've had zero since 1990, although we're talking about it. So a rational forecast is to say that we won't have any available by 2050. What about energy? We are growing our non-emitting electricity generation, particularly in the UK. That's a good success story. But here on the blue line, let's look at how much energy we would need if we electrify everything that we do today. If we convert all cars, all trucks, buses, all industrial processes to using electricity, using today's technology, you can see that the blue line shows that our demand is likely to rise into the future. The orange line shows the supply of non-emitting electricity in the UK, and it's growing. That's terrific, but it's not growing fast enough. The rate at which it's growing means that we're going to be quite short. We'll have 50 to 60% of what we want by the year 2050. And don't forget, as we said last time, if we use any hydrogen or any negative emissions technologies, the demand for electricity, the blue line, will go up even faster. So the rational way of planning for getting to zero emissions, the safe strategy, is to assume that all we can draw on is non-emitting electricity, but we're only going to have about half the amount that we want to have. Does that mean living with carrots up your nose, as the Prime Minister recently said, or is there actually a reasonable lifestyle that we could have? We first looked at that in 2019 when we published the Absolute Zero report, which was the first attempt to describe getting to zero emissions with a realistic projection of supply and using today's technologies. And on the cover we used the tick, which is the inspiration for the name of these films, Tick Zero. The emissions, the bottom line, have to get to zero by 2050. We won't have as much energy as we want for a period, so there's a period of restraint, and then eventually the supply of non-emitting electricity will grow, and we will be able to resume some of the activities that we temporarily need to restrain. So let's think about what that means in more detail. Firstly, let's look at the way that we use energy in buildings. On this graph, below the line are energy forms that are not currently electricity, and above the line is electricity. If we converted all of these into electricity, we would need this amount, but we can only budget for having about 60% of that. So could we live well in our buildings, stay warm, be comfortable with water and so on, using only 60% of the electricity we'd like to have? The great news is yes, we can. If we use efficient heat pumps, if we make our appliances more efficient, particularly by making them smaller, it won't be any surprise to you to know that having a fridge that's so large you can walk into it wastes energy compared to the fridge that's smaller, that's actually required for storing food in most homes. We can make houses with much better insulation, which are much more airtight, particularly new builds. That would be an easy change to make to regulations now that would flow through as houses are built in the next 28 years. We can refit better insulation and glazing, and we can make our lighting more efficient. And if we do that with technologies that we already know today, we can comfortably live well in our buildings with only 60% of the electricity. What about in transport? Well, almost all of our transport today is not electric, as you can see here. Only a certain amount of our trains, and of course the growing trend of electric cars, are currently electric. If we electrify everything, then you can see how much electricity we would need here. But what we've had to rule out there is both aeroplanes and ships. As we stand, there are a small number of battery-powered ships working on the fjords of Norway, but there are no big international freighters. So for now, we'll have to assume that international trade occurs by electric train. And although there are some electric aeroplanes taking off, there's one powered by solar cells, which powered one person to go around the world. There are some battery-powered aeroplanes that will do short trips with a small number of people. Nobody in the world is designing an electric aeroplane to do long-haul flight. And because of what we said about hydrogen, we won't have enough electricity to make synthetic fuel. So for the getting to our realistic plan, we have to assume that aviation in effect shuts over the next 28 years. So for the remaining vehicles, those which have wheels, then can we power them with 60% of the energy that we would use if we converted them today? It turns out we can. We can apply regenerative braking to capture and generate electricity as we bring vehicles to a halt. We can improve the way we use them. Still today, half of all journeys taken by trucks are empty as they return to the depot having finished their delivery. We can do better than that by different forms of organisation. Amazingly, every year since 1990, the cars on the road of the UK have become heavier because they're getting bigger. It's not in the United Nations Charter on Human Rights that we have to drive a car that's 12.5 times heavier than the people inside it, but that's what we're doing at the moment. Clearly, we could live well with lighter cars and still be able to travel with the same safety and comfort that we do today. We just need the cars to be smaller. We can also switch to rail and use more efficient tyres on our road vehicles, and as a result of that, we could cut our energy use to 60% and maintain the service that we currently have from transport. Finally, what about industry? Well, it's a more complicated picture in industry because almost all the emissions of industry are from making materials. Shaping them into products or into buildings in construction takes a relatively small amount of energy. It's making the materials that matters, and they're made in processes that are already very efficient. However, we could electrify most of them. The only problems are processes where the chemistry of making the material leads to emissions anyway. And that means that we have to stop making cement, there are currently no alternatives for that, and stop making new steel. With all the other materials, we can pretty much guarantee that we could get to very nearly zero emissions production if we electrified them. So the story for the UK is that we'll have about 60% of the electricity we need, and we can live very well within that. Let's just tell the same story now, going back to our global pie chart of the way that the activities that drive emissions. Here it is, we saw this in one of the earlier films, and following through the same strategies, the first thing is to close the sectors that lead to emissions however they're powered. So that's ruminant animals, sheep and cows, planes and ships because we haven't got enough electricity available for them, and the processes of making cement and new steel. So they have to shut over the next 28 years. We can electrify everything else. The technologies already exist for us to do so. But we won't have as much electricity as we need. We can use roughly half the amount of electricity by applying the strategies I've just talked through for the UK worldwide. We aren't using energy well because we've had so much of it, we haven't thought carefully about it. And by having smaller vehicles and better buildings, it's easy for us to live well to today's developed lifestyles with much less energy. I want to end just by going back to the graph I showed in the last film about political discussions about getting to zero emissions at the moment. You remember we had axes here of the amount of non-emitting electricity available and the amount of carbon storage available. And what we looked at was that the space being described in policy is unreachable given realistic levels of growth. What we did in the Absolute Zero report is to choose no carbon storage and a realistic continued linear growth of non-emitting electricity, and that gets us to this point here. So you can see how a realistic description of zero emissions is quite different to what's under discussion, but it's a perfectly good lifestyle. More than that, the things that we most value can grow and expand. And it doesn't matter whether your preference is for sport, for singing, for having a great time in the bath, for having meals with friends, for love and romance, for being with your families, going on holidays, for leisure, for spending time with children, and for singing. All of these activities can grow and grow. The things that we most value don't in fact depend on energy, obviously once we've got to a level of security and safety. So it's not a life of misery that we're trying to describe here. We said last time that in order for solutions to become real, they have to meet all of these criteria of acceptability. At the moment, the technology solutions look so attractive because they appear to meet these, but they can't scale fast enough. If we're to activate real climate solutions, then we know that some of what we have to do, for example, stopping flying, looks like a big challenge to the way people live at the moment. So much of a challenge that politicians aren't even telling people that it's true, but you know it's true because an aeroplane takes in fossil fuel at one end and generates greenhouse gas emissions at the other. Where else could it go? So what we now need to do is to start activating every possible option that we've discussed in this film to start the journey to acceptability over the next 28 years' time. And the only way we can do that is to get going. We've described in this film a realistic trajectory to getting to zero emissions. It isn't what people choose at the moment, but it's perfectly acceptable. So next time, if politics isn't going to deliver this, we've got to look about how it might start to happen by entrepreneurs developing new businesses or changing the way that businesses operate to profit from the reality of the journey to real zero emissions.